an introduction, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you today and to share a couple tidbits of information. My objectives are really for you to take away from this at least one real strong nugget that will move you closer to performing to your potential and really optimizing your potential. And I'm confident that everyone will get something out of this, and I'm even going to be overly optimistic and believe that you're going to get more than one thing. So the way that I'm going to share information with you today is give you a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about, and invite you to gather something to write with, to take some notes with, because this is going to be a dynamic presentation. I'm not going to continue with a didactic lecture. I'm going to give you a lot of questions to write down that you can spontaneously respond to yourself while you're participating today. You can reflect on them afterwards, but these are useful, poignant questions that will help you in your discovery process to really tap into your inner potential. So I invite you to gather some of that information today, some of those resources, so you can move along and make this an engaged endeavor. Today's presentation is going to include a number of things where I'm going to focus on really the experience of repurposing, and repurposing based on the current situation, repurposing based on some proven psychological habits and psychological research that is associated with leadership. And specifically, I'm going to give you some anecdotal stories about some clients and some organizations that I have worked with on these issues, so you can see the practical application of how you do this, right? It's not so much how do you build the supersonic plane, but how do you fly the supersonic plane when you want to get in that cockpit and take action. So I'm going to share these interesting and useful anecdotal stories with you to give you some illustrations about how people have struggled with some of the same things that we have all struggled with, and how they have successfully overcome that with either a new blueprint, a new direction, a new action plan, or a new insight. So without further ado, I'm going to move into my first topic. And what I want to first talk about is really validation and the acknowledgement of experiences of friction and disruption. There was a really interesting book that came out during the pandemic called Life is in the Transitions. And I'll give you these references after the presentation if anybody wants them. But it was an interesting point of view because it articulated in a very narrative way about how people are people. And you can't assume that simply because someone has a certain achievement or a certain professional status or a certain house or a certain car or a certain zip code that everything is flawless. And the reality is that people go through all kinds of friction. And during this pandemic, I think it's really important to underscore and take note that there is a more general consensus and acceptance of the notion of the importance of well-being, and more specifically, mental well-being. There used to be a real stigma about mental illness and language associated with that. And now there seems to be a shifting where people are understanding that this is really important stuff. Not only does my own well-being matter, but the well-being of the other people that I am working with also matters. And even though that may not be revealed to me, it's something that I need to be aware of in my own self-awareness. So the point that I want to illustrate with that is, even pre-pandemic, people were going through experiences of a lot of disruption and friction in their lives, and you may not have been aware of it, or maybe you were a trusted coworker or colleague and you were aware of it, right? But the point is that now, having gone through the pandemic, psychologically, this is what we call a global trauma, a global disruptor, that there has been a substantial loss for almost everyone in some capacity. For some people, it's been a loss of employment. For some people, it's been a loss of life. For some people, it's been a loss of impairment because they've gotten sick. It could be loss of stability because of a family member going into a nursing home, like what happened in my family. So it's important to have this collective acknowledgement that this has been a real disruptor. This has been a real collective trauma experience. And it doesn't mean that we're all diagnosed with PTSD, but it means that this is something that has had a substantial emotional impact. A colleague of mine, prior to the pandemic, was going through a significant series of disruptions with his family. He's working in high tech in the top 10, and he's got one child with ADHD, another child with autism who's mute. And then during the pandemic, to top off parenting 3 young children, 2 with special needs, his wife came down with a medical condition that was really destabilizing her nervous system and her muscular system. And here we have a scenario where we've got someone who's expected to be a high performer at work, to be a terrific, outstanding, loving husband, to be a great dad, and anybody could be in those shoes, right? So the point is that you and I may not have the visibility of that, but the relevance is that we need to have our own self-awareness about how the pandemic has affected us, our own families, ourselves, and then secondly, how it's affected the other people that we've worked with. And when we have that, we have 2 benefits. One is we improve our self-awareness. Self-awareness is a characteristic, a psychological competency that is correlated highly with top leaders. So improving one's self-awareness is a real achievement. And secondly, it also generates a sense of compassion. And having compassion gives you the ability to have better reciprocity in your relationships. So think about those 2 things and how they have affected you and how they have affected the people that you work with or your teams or your organizations. Now, getting specifically now into some of the meat of this in terms of transitions. So one of the things that I like as a concept is this question, what is your one thing? Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, I like to ask that question in a variety of ways. And one of the ways that I ask the question, and I invite you to write down this question for yourselves right now, what keeps you up at night? Now, that sounds like a very simple, elementary question, but it's, for me, been a very revealing question because it's not literally what keeps you up at night. Hopefully you're sleeping well, but it's what is on your mind, right? What is kind of scraping at your inner being, your inner soul, your inner passion that is really scratching this itch of passion. And that was a question that I asked a client that I was working with who was a up-and-coming rising star at MSNBC and was really struggling in her transition to move up the ladder, as they say. And I asked her that question. And her answer was very informative, which was that she was doing an outstanding job. She was well recognized, but she wasn't doing exactly what she wanted. And she wanted to transition from being a journalist into being a vlogger, video interviewer, a variety of terms that we use nowadays. But essentially, she wanted to be her own video interviewer and have her own talk show. So the question is then, what was preventing her from accomplishing that? Once we identified the one thing, right? What were some of the barriers? So interestingly, what we discovered together was that she had an expansive network. So you can imagine a journalist has a whole list of really talented, bright, successful people that they've spoken to. Well, this was the list that she could tap into to move into her new role, her side hustle, her endeavor, her one thing, right? To really start to demonstrate this talent and passion that was really driving her. So it's an important concept to make a distinction between what you're good at, which is exactly what was happening with her, versus what you're passionate about, which she was not experiencing that sense of fulfillment. So I invite you to think about, not necessarily what's keeping you up at night, but asking yourself the question, what are you most passionate about? And if you're lucky enough to be doing something that you're passionate about right now, then the question is sort of repurposed a little bit, retooled into how can you amplify that passion, right? Because you can always do better, right? If you are a successful oriented person, you can always do better. And doing better may be something like giving back, maybe something like mentoring, it may be something like networking, right? So how can you amplify your passion? And I think the reality is that nobody has their passion cup full 100% of the time, all the time, right? So this is an example of really fine tuning and tweaking that burning passion. Now, if you're unsure, which some people that I meet with are, they say, well, I don't know what I'm passionate about, or what I'm passionate about, I'm just not anymore. And I really don't know. I'm kind of stuck. And that's a ubiquitous experience. So there's nothing unusual, uncommon about that. That feeling stuck has been a very present word that I've heard over the last 15 months, feeling stuck. So to get unstuck, it's really important to ask yourself, these kinds of inquiry questions. What really drives me? What intrigues me? What is my curiosity, right? Because things that you're curious about as an intelligent person drive passion. So curiosities is another way to explore that. And then the third recommendation I'm going to give for you about that is, while you're journaling these things, right? And I'm a huge fan of journaling, and if I have time, I'll tell you a story about that. But journaling will give you the opportunity to write some thoughts down, reflect on them, and discuss those thoughts with trusted friends and colleagues, right? So that's the action step. It's not just to stay stuck. It's to write down ideas, meet with people that you can trust to share your ideas, your curiosities, your passion, and get feedback, right? And that feedback will create the feedback loop that will help you take the next step to fine-tuning, starting, or amplifying your passion. Okay. Now let's talk about misalignment. Everyone has misalignments in their life. Okay, a misalignment is a friction point. And I want to tell you a story about a misalignment with a woman who was a successful investor in a startup incubator down in Greater Miami. She was really frustrated with the coworker of hers who was operating as the COO. And the relationship started off terrific, as all relationships do. We can all probably reflect back and think about some dating relationships that started off great and didn't really end well. Well, this relationship started off like that. And the COO was a real firecracker. She was super intelligent, witty, showed really strong management skills, and was super ambitious, just a real hard charger, hard worker. But then what happened was, it became known that her management style was a little bit more tyrannical than was originally believed to be. And it started creating a lot of friction in the startup incubator community. It started creating friction with a lot of the seed investors and the capital investors that were involved. And my client was really struggling with, instead of fixing the problem behind the scenes, confronting the relationship difficulties and having a real heart-to-heart with this person about the misalignment that was happening, and really poignantly stating that something needed to change. So first, what we did was we acknowledged the problem, which was the validation piece for her. So you have to validate areas of misalignment in your professional life. They can be, everyone's had a supervisor or a boss where there was an aspect, at least, or an element of misalignment, I'm sure. But when it gets to this degree, there has to be a real appraisal of the problem. So getting back to the original introduction, my background in forensics, forensics is solving complex problems by looking at multiple sources of data. That's the scientific explanation of it. So you have a proper appraisal of the problem, an objective, neutral, minimally biased appraisal of the problem. And then from there, you can develop your approach. So the approach that I recommended for dealing with this misalignment was one that was focused on a communication style that was non-confrontational, right? And we take a lot of psychological research and apply it into this methodology we call motivational interviewing, which includes assertive communication without being confrontational. So saying like, Susie, I really need to speak with you about something that's troubling. And then from there, being able to have a communication style that uses some of those motivational interviewing techniques, which are things like, it sounds like you're saying, your point of view is, fill in the blank, and can we propose a solution that would look at X, right? So looking at real neutral communication style versus a confrontation, which of course we know from the research affects the brain. So the brain becomes dysregulated as soon as the conversation becomes emotional. So that was an example of how she confronted a relationship misalignment and was able to have that conversation and transition that person into a slightly different role and to be more accepting of some help that she was unwilling to be accepting of. The relevance for yourselves is perhaps, for your homework is to reflect on misalignments in work relationships that may exist right now or in past relationships, right? So you can do what I would call a psychological autopsy of misalignments. So the question is, what went wrong in this relationship, or what in the business? And the relationship doesn't have to be a coworker. It could have been a customer, a client, right? What went wrong with that? And go through some of those steps and thinking about what broke down in the communication, what were the misunderstandings, what were the misperceptions. This transitions nicely into one of my favorite topics to talk about, which is creativity and innovation and intuition. And the reality of today's society is that we are in a digital society of knowledge workers that relies specifically on the collective intelligence of the people that we work with. We are, as I said earlier, we're complex problem solvers. So whether that innovation and creativity is for a service, or it's for a product, or it's for a system, we are challenged. And interestingly, in the one of the news lines this morning from the Office of the President was about really elevating the competitiveness, I think was the main word that was used, in U.S. organizations, that we're getting a little bit lazy. We're getting to be a little bit of laggards with this. And how do we push that competitive drive? And I'm not going to get into the macro and microeconomics because that's surely outside of my realm of expertise. But what we're really speaking about on an individual level is asking oneself, what kinds of complex problems am I working on, and how am I doing with that? What am I challenged with innovating to make a system or a service or a product frictionless or appealing or something that delights the client or the customer? How do I organize a team or an organization in a macro level that creates a culture that envelopes appreciation, where people feel that their diversity is welcomed in a way to grow the company, to grow the organization in a way that shows appreciation for that diverse thinking that drives innovation and intuition. There was a tech team that I worked with pre-pandemic, and they were really looking at building and improving their creative process. They had an extraordinary number of gifted people, but they were kind of siloed out in their cubicles a little bit, and they had, you know, organizational leadership development and professional development. But down at the team level, they were struggling with, you know, how do we sort of harness everybody's unique knowledge base and unique knowledge expertise outside of their skills. Okay, so when we say outside of skills, we're talking about psychological competencies, right? What exactly are those things that make that person successful? Like, how are they getting better at what they're doing, you know, and how are they doing it? So we tried a very simple experiment, and here's what we did. The task for the beginning of the meetings changed, where the question was, tell us something and share what you are learning right now and how you're learning about it, right? What are you learning and how are you learning about it? And that simple inquiry is central to a well-established psychological principle by Carol Dweck, the growth mindset, right? That people that innovate grow, and they grow their knowledge base, and they expand their intelligence. They flex that muscle consistently. So by having a team meeting of 15 start off and by asking the question, what are you learning about and how are you learning it? You just had an input of 15 new learning resources, right, to add to your own portfolio for learning. And then secondly, you also had an opportunity to hear about other people's platforms, which could be an ebook, a trade journal, a podcast, a YouTube video, a Netflix documentary. Right now, you know, we're just all over the place with this stuff, and access to really useful tacit information has never been easier than it is now. So now the challenge is harnessing the precise information that's useful for you. And for that team, that was a useful intervention for them to further expand their creativity and their innovation. The second question, 2 of 2, which they pivoted to include in their beginning of their meetings, was sharing a complex problem that was solved and then giving a brief overview of how they solved it. And that, again, it didn't necessarily have to be a coding strategy. It didn't have to be anything technologically driven, but it was more important to understand sort of the mindset of the person and their personal story, how they tackled the problem, how they overcame it, what kind of resources that they use, what did they discover, right? Because if you think about any complex problem that you've worked on, and there was probably a moment where you got some help with it, there was probably an aha moment where you learned something that you hadn't previously known, and then all of a sudden it came together and you solved it. That's useful information for people to hear. Nowadays, my new complex problem solving thing during the pandemic was learning how to do things around my historic house. And I learned how to do masonry by digging into a resource and learning from a collective group of experts, masonists around the world, and refacing my fireplace. So simple things like that, you know, open the door and pathways to an approach that is a proven methodology for improving creativity and innovation and leveraging the collective intelligence of your team. If you're not with a team, then a group like this is, of course, you know, an unbelievable resource where you can pose these kinds of questions not only to yourself, but to people within your group and benefit from what they are doing as well. One other question that I want you to add to your list, just to close out this topic, or two questions, something to reflect on afterwards. So what are you reading right now to expand your skills? Okay, and you can be real specific about skill. And then the second part of that question is, how are you applying that learning? Okay, so it's, what are you reading? Could be watching. You don't have to, I'm not anchoring everybody down to a book. But what are you learning for improving skills? And then how are you applying it? And those are important questions because that will go back to your burning passion that we talked about in the beginning. right? And there should be an alignment between those two things, right? So we talked about alignment and misalignments. I gave the example in a business relationship, but it's a central theme, right? So there has to be an alignment between learning and application of learning aligned with your passion. That's the objective. And if there's a misalignment, that's where you can spend some time reflecting, asking, searching, inquiring, being curious, and discovering what's the misalignment, or filling in some of the gaps in that. All right. Next topic. This one is near and dear to my heart because it's something that I would consider a core value in terms of my business principles and those that I personally admire. The theme of this domain is how to be a people-first professional. And there's been a lot of inquiries about people-centered, and I've seen titles across the LinkedIn commentaries and headlines, director of people, director of happiness. And I think they're saying some of the same things, but I'm going to tell two stories about where it's true, and then another scenario where it's not true, and it's created a lot of friction for folks, so we can make a distinction about what this is. But one of the companies that I like to highlight, because it was something that I read and listened to a long time ago, is Patagonia. So all you Californians are proud residents of that institution. But Yvon Chouinard, who founded the company, wrote a book, which is a really interesting management book, which I would call a people-first book, called Let My People Go Surfing. Not necessarily something that you would hear from a typical CEO. But the book, which is a short and enjoyable read, really gets into this core value, which not only is important from an organizational standpoint, but as I'm going to illustrate shortly, in all professional relationships, it shows the core value of people appreciation. Okay, people appreciation. We just simply don't talk and do people appreciation enough. And it's really one of the easiest things to do, because what is people appreciation? My definition of people appreciation is you get to know somebody, you admire something in that person, and you show appreciation for it. And it doesn't matter if it's a skill or an achievement or a position, it's person-centered. We have a whole discipline of psychology called person-centered psychology. It's been around for a long time for a lot of good reasons. It works. So being people-centered and showing appreciation is a core value that really works well in organizations. Now, in one example, let me start with the example how it worked really well. So during the pandemic, I was consulting with a Cisco sales manager, and she was telling me a story following some discussion about how she had reached out to a number of her clients, and one of her customers was in the sales funnel, and it was a really big sale, and it was in the middle of the pandemic, and everybody was panicking about economics and this, that, and the other thing. And instead of talking about product or talking about bringing up the sales topic, she took the approach of just checking in and saying, hey, how are you making out, with all of this? That was really the nature of the call. It was what I would say a flawless, perfect, person-centered conversation, where her interest really was authentic and genuine. She wasn't pushing anything with the sales. She wasn't probing to see, what was happening on behind the scenes in terms of decisions. It was just a simple touch point to check in. And organizations that do that regularly, I think we all know who they are, companies that have that customer service that's person-centered and customer-centered and client-centered versus automated and 6 steps through buttons, right? You really do feel appreciated. When I buy a pair of sneakers from Zappos and it comes in there and they tell me on the label, you're appreciated. If there's anything wrong, just let us know and we'll call you up and we'll solve this. You don't even have to worry about it. That is a company that is fulfilling its promise, and the people that answer the phone are fulfilling the promise. So when she called up her customer and asked how he was doing, and they spent a half an hour chit-chatting about all of the ups and downs and parenting little kids at home and the closure of schools and things like that, he ended the call simply by saying, oh, and hey, by the way, we're still going to do this deal. I'm signing the paperwork and you're going to receive the payment in X number of days, just like that. So, that is an example of, taking control over professional responsibility, right? Because she had responsibilities to her supervisors and teams to meet financial obligations and sales objectives. But on the other hand, she did it in a way that was authentic, and that is a thriving relationship now. And I'm sure the next sale and the sale after that will be much, much easier. Now, on the other hand, what happens in companies and relationships where there is an absence of people appreciation? So there was a mining and drilling company that reached out to me, and really interesting company. It wasn't the boring company. Unfortunately, it wasn't a contract with Elon Musk, but it was a big mining and drilling company, and they were having trouble with attrition. So I started my process using my forensic skills, and I said, well, let me take a look at the company's core values and beliefs. So it read a little bit like Patagonia's, but so I made my list, I printed it out, and I called up the CHRO and I said, okay, so here's your core values. I said, tell me specifically how you are fulfilling those core values that you promised your people. One of them, of course, was professional development. I said, tell me exactly what you offer for professional development for all your people. And the answer was, well, we don't. Okay. It turned out that they were only offering it to upper management. And when we looked at the attrition, it was a lot of the people, through surveys, we discovered and understood that they were not feeling that the promises that were offered to them about their professional development and elevating their proficiency was being fulfilled. So that absence in fulfillment was leading to a strong attrition rate. Ironically, the CHRO quit during my consultation with the organization, further underscoring the problem. So, with this customer appreciation, you have to start with yourself. So let me give you just a couple questions that I use when I'm making a real deliberate effort. Now it's pretty much ingrained. I do it naturally. It's just my nature. But when you're getting to meet someone professionally, number one, stop talking and just listen. I don't mean to sound like a teacher, sit down and be quiet, but really, like, everyone has plenty to say, and if they're a good quality person, you will have your turn. So I have found that letting other people start first really puts them at ease. It's a very disarming method to help people feel appreciated, help them feel welcome, help them feel like this is an authentic, meeting or communication, and listen with them with a genuine curiosity to learn about that person, right? You really want to get to know them. If you're going to be spending time with this person, doing business with them, growing with them, selling to them, buying from them, you really, it's in your best interest to learn about them, right? Because you want them to be happy if they're a buyer or a seller or a coworker, and you want to be happy. So it makes complete sense. Now, sometimes that's difficult. I understand that there's a couple people on the planet with difficult personalities. I know nobody on this call is one of them, including myself. But I understand that is not a traditional approach. Okay, so sometimes you got to massage and ease into it a little bit. And one of the ways to massage and ease into it is to ask people how they spend their free time. And you can ask that question a number of different ways. What did you do last weekend? What do you do for fun? Okay. those two questions open the door just enough where you get to learn about that person's real interests, because their real interests are probably not, capital investments, stocks and bonds, AI, innovation technologies, right? I mean, it is, but there's also this other thing that's like a secret, right? That really drives their passion, really excites them, right? And when people are excited, okay, and when people feel listened to, it builds trust, which is the objective, right? So you want to understand, okay, how people spend their time aside from doing what they do, because it opens the door to an authentic relationship. If the person says, oh, I play tennis with my wife, or I play tennis with my husband. It doesn't matter if you're a tennis player or not, right? You can say, wow, that's interesting. How did you start that hobby? How did that happen? Well, I started taking lessons when I was 6, and you get to hear the story, right? And the story matters because people's stories tell you about their successful histories, their trajectories, how they got to where they got. It gives you the opportunity to show appreciation for things like grit, right? And a growth mindset and the accomplishments that they've had, right? And then maybe you'll be lucky enough to have, a cousin or an aunt who plays tennis, and you can say, well, I'm familiar with it a little bit because my aunt plays it. But it also, more importantly, opens the door for you then to say, right, getting back to the concept of reciprocity, oh, that's wonderful, Cindy or Stanley. I spent my weekend doing X. And then you have your turn to tell your story about what's passionate for you, right? This is reciprocity that's transactional and builds this really important concept called trust. And I want to say two things about trust. Trust builds relationships, personal and professional, right? You will not sell something to somebody who does not trust you. You will not get hired by somebody who does not trust you. You will not work well with someone who does not trust you, right? And the reciprocal is true of that, of course, as well. Trustworthy relationships, just like my Cisco story, drives transactions. It drives transactions of sales. It drives transactions in projects. It drives transactions in innovation and creativity, like we were speaking about earlier. Now, a last story on appreciation that I want to share is it's again from another a lot of California people, another California VP who was formerly at Intuit. Really cool guy. Was he's in the pricing area, and he was tasked with being given a new position and taking on a new team and onboarding new people. And we were working together, collaborating, figuring out, well, how can he make all of this work, right? In the midst of the pandemic, in the midst of still being remote, in the midst of wildfires going around, a month or so ago. So real, compounding factors. So what we came up with as a solution, which encompasses everything that I just spoke about, was on a Friday afternoon, bringing everybody together in this new team that was being built, going outside, getting a food truck, bringing some yard games, and family members were invited, including children. Why? Because they could do it in a socially distanced way. It was social. It was, non-intrusive. Parents didn't have to worry about childcare. They had games and things that build trust and reciprocity in teams in a natural way, right? And it was an opportunity for all of them to simply hang out and get to know each other. And that was the stepping stone for assembling this new team in this very complicated situation for people and their families, and launching that group into what will soon become high performers. So we're getting close to the end, and I want to be mindful of time. So I'm going to get right into the last two topics. So the next topic is called converting dreams into precision-focused manifestation. And I want to tell you just a very short story about a professor that I worked with, a college professor who was working on her dream of tenure. Okay, so she had her dream identified. She basically knew what the objectives were to accomplish that. But what was missing was the blueprint. Okay, so the key metrics when you're working on your dream and making it a precision focused manifestation, you have to have the steps along the way. Okay, so you start with the goal and you work backwards. So her goal was 5 years out. That's when she was up for tenure. And we worked backwards from there by year, by month, by quarter. And then we really drilled down to the calendar. And this maybe perhaps for some of you, I know for me a long time ago, it was extremely helpful information, but the super helpful tip for a daily basis is if it's not on your calendar, it's not going to happen. Okay. So I know this sounds, maybe it sounds a little petty or silly. I live and die by my calendar with alarm number 1 and alarm number 2. And if I don't put in, book writing time, if I don't put in reading time, learning time, if I don't put it in, sometimes more often than I want, it gets put off. So if there's one thing that I can encourage you to do to really make things happen that you want to happen, it's got to be on your calendar with great discipline. Now, last but not least, the 7 powerful, this is the Stephen Covey 7 powerful positive psychology tips. So here's what I've kind of fine-tuned collectively with the psychological research, right? Where, everybody has written about this, everybody votes with their hands up. And this is kind of a checklist for you, your little checklist manifesto to wrap up today and say, okay, how am I doing on this, right? So the way that I like to approach it is 0 is not at all, 1 is partially, and 2 is consistently. Okay, so you get a 0, 1, or a 2. Positive psychological habits, sleep, number 1, okay? Number 2, nutrition. Number 3, personalized medicine. What do I mean by personalized medicine? I mean having a medical provider who gives you personalized feedback about your wellness and your longevity. So that is some additional homework. You can research more about personalized medicine and maybe about genetic mapping and DNA sequencing and nutritional supplementing that is not just, off the shelf at GNC, but really tailored towards, your blood chemistry makeup and your age and your demographics and your all other kinds of physical attributes. Number 4, exercise. Number 5, mindfulness and or meditation. We could have done a whole workshop on mindfulness and meditation, but it is a proven practice, even 5 minutes a day. I do 10 minutes a day every morning. That's my routine. My routine is 10 minutes of meditation, and then I journal. And that's how I start my day. And I find that drives my innovation, my self-awareness, my appraisal of alignments and misalignments and opportunities and discoveries that fulfill my passion. Number 6, nurturing personal and professional relationships. Right? So work-life balance, simple as that, right? And there's a greater appreciation for that, but you have to have some reciprocity in those areas. And then last but not least, I really encourage folks to consider taking a replenishment retreat. A replenishment retreat is based on this concept that we call self-care. It's a really good thing, right? To take care of yourself. There's really nothing wrong or selfish about that. And your replenishment retreat can take a number of different forms. I'm lucky to be in this really cool building, and sometimes my replenishment retreat is getting in the elevator, going downstairs, and then doing a session of yoga, and then going up 1 floor and going in. We have these float tanks where you can float in salt bath and just relax. And then that's an opportunity. Now I'm like totally clear, sit down, write, work on some ideas, that kind of thing. So it could be that, it could be getting away for a weekend, it could be going camping, it could be going to a hotel, it could be going to a cabin on a lake, right? It could be going to some kind of spiritual center, but doing that, on a quarterly basis, making time for that, right? So getting it on your calendar is a really productive experience. You can do it alone. You can do it with your significant other. You can maybe do it with somebody else that's going through the same experience, right? There's a lot of hybrid ways that you can do that, but doing that with consistency, replenishes, right? Because to be optimal in a consistent way, we all have to replenish. As far as I know, none of us still have superpowers yet. I hear it's coming, maybe in another 10 years, but we need to replenish. And with that, I want to thank you for the opportunity to have shared these thoughts with you. And I invite and welcome any questions and any feedback that you have afterwards to stay connected.
All right, Eric, thank you. You said so many things that I think are valuable, and I know we only have 4 minutes, but the listen with curiosity, and I think about, whether it's in sales or you're building a team or you're looking for a job, it's like that listen with curiosity before you talk. Oh my gosh, imagine the rapport that immediately develops when you do that.
Yeah. And just as an aside, the #1 predictor for psychotherapy outcomes, for therapy outcomes, is not the type of therapy, it's not the therapist, it's not where they're from, it's not where they went to school, it's rapport.
Okay, so Deborah Mania asks, can you give an example of misalignment between learning, application of learning, and your passion?
Learning, application, and your passion. Yes. So I'll tell you something I'm passionate about. So I'm passionate about making homemade wine. I've been doing it for 7 years. Okay. If I'm not learning how to do that better and talking with winemakers and going to the people that get the grapes from your lovely California, that's a misalignment. Then I'm just winging it and I'm making really lousy Malbec and Merlots every year. In the professional space, I'm constantly looking at proven psychological factors associated with leadership. So how do I do that? I'm reading peer-reviewed journal articles about that. And I'm thinking about applications for that with my clients and organizations. So there has to be that alignment between the process, the passion, and the outcome.
Oh, I love it. Okay, now Eric, how can people get a hold of you, and how can they work with you?
I'm on LinkedIn. Some of you, thank you for reaching out ahead of time. That was really kind and generous. I appreciate that. So find me on LinkedIn, connect, let's chat, hang out. If you're in the area, swing by. I'll take you out for a good espresso.
Okay, and then we're going to send out the recording to the people that had registered. We'll send out your contact information. And I just want to clarify, you work with individuals and you work with companies as well.
Yes.
Awesome. And then somebody asked one last question. What do you think about studying NLP as training to build rapport?
I think that's a systematic methodology to utilize, but I think it's a little bit unnatural. I think it's a little bit too mechanical. I think that you could learn it better and apply it better in a naturalistic setting. So you could meet with a psychologist or some other person who has those expertise and really it's kind of build it into your own DNA, right? Bake it into your own authenticity versus learning a system about what does it mean when they raise their left eyebrow here? What is it? This person tilted their head. This person sat back. This guy's really confident now. That kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay, got it. And then one is Anna asks, how do you align passion and making enough to make a living, make enough money to make a living?
Yep. So the short answer to that is a lot of folks have a side hustle. So I was working with this really awesome woman, young up and starter in finance on Wall Street, and she was really getting frustrated with her job because she was doing all the work and getting none of the credit. So I really understood where she was coming from. Well, she was working on a side hustle to do her own little, not little, but she had big plans to work on real estate investment. So, you have to start small. You have to start somewhere. There's all kinds of books on, agile work and, startup businesses and, get in with some incubators, talk to people, friends and family, get some ideas. and start small and grow big. And then of course, you know, for everyone, you know, there's that piece of the emotional piece, which is risk tolerance, right? So you just have to develop some level of comfort with some of the uncertainty that goes along with that.
Okay, thank you, Eric. All right, we're out of time and we're going to have you back. I know that people are going to want you back, and thank you so much for your time, and really appreciate it. We'll send out your contact information. Thank you everyone for joining us.